Welcome, everyone. Glad you're here with us here at 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. We're going to dive in today, really quickly. Going to get to our lead text pretty fast and aggressively. Got a lot to say already, kind of looking at my notes, and these have been longer than I expected. We're quickly moving from 15 minutes and a big idea to 20 minutes and an overextended idea, but a lot of these things are important. I want to move through them and give them the respect that they're due because they're important and we don't have a lot of chance to talk about them otherwise. So today, moving quickly into the text, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 7 through 9. How's that for an intro? 1 Corinthians 7, verses 7 through 9. Yet I wish that all men were even as myself am. However, each has his own gift from God, one in this way and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows that it is good for them to remain even as I. But if they do not have self-control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. This text moves in a little bit of a different direction. While I'm thinking about it, like and subscribe, follow the Minute Collective, and follow 15 Minutes and Big Idea on all the fun platforms. All right, we're back in. It's the thing I left off in my quick intro. You can add that back to the time. Moving in a different direction. And I actually think this is the first one where I haven't given a content warning in like a month, which is pretty refreshing. Unfortunately for me, this week represents the reprieve is basically the momentary transition while you're in the air, moving from the frying pan into the fire. We've gone from sexual misconduct and sexual rhythms within marriage, and next week we're going to talk about divorce and remarriage, which is probably just as high stakes, probably more controversial. So that's great. Specifically, in the last two sections, Paul has condemned sexual immorality in the strongest terms. There's no room to even argue about this. It's harmful to the people involved. It brings you under the mastery of that sin. It dishonors Christ. It brings your body, which belongs to Christ, into that union in some way. And it is a sin against your own body, which is possessed by God for his glory. Because of this sexual immorality, it has to be fled. Sexual immorality must be fled. But sex within marriage is good. In fact, it is a normative obligation for spouses towards each other in order to prevent sexual immorality. And the reason this is such an obligation is because spouses mutually possess each other's bodies. The mutual participation in sexual relations should be a blessing that brings a couple together, and it should stave off sexual sin. So spouses must not categorically deny each other, and especially not unilaterally, but any time of absence should be mutually agreed upon for the sake of their collective spiritual strength, rather than the undermining of either spouse's self-control. However, this text that we just mentioned and talked about deals explicitly and only with people who are married. What about everybody else? What does fleeing sexual immorality and the rightness of sexuality within marriage say to them? That brings us to this big idea, which is marriage is a kingdom decision. Marriage is a kingdom decision. To unpack that, we'll look at number one. God has gifted differently. 2, singlehood is good. Number 3, marriage is good. God has gifted differently. Singlehood is good, and marriage is good. Gifted, singlehood, and marriage. First point, let's slide in here. Paul begins with the word yet. Some take his concession versus command in verse 6, which we moved through very quickly last time, to refer to these commands about singlehood today. There's a can of worms behind that involves textual criticism. If you want us to talk about that, Q&R, drop that in the comments below your question, or you can send us an email at our podcast email. But I think it makes the most sense for the not commanded concession to be about an intimacy hiatus between spouses. These instructions to the unmarried seem to make sense as moving in a different direction from that previous text where Paul wishes that all people are as he is. And what he means by that is unmarried, which he'll clarify down in verse number 8. He's going to expand on this a lot, actually, later in the chapter, and that's an important thing. So I don't want to get too deep into the weeds, but we also want to understand what he is saying here. He's not saying, even though that he wishes all would be like him, that he thinks his situation is superior. Rather, that marital obligations, sexual and otherwise, they complicate a person's life. Hopefully they complicate them in a good way. While they can provide tremendous joy, at the very least, the commitments take time. And at worst, they're actually quite destructive and bring a curse on people for getting into bad marriages which are poorly handled. Paul then has a bias towards people not marrying because of the flexibility they have in serving in the kingdom, which is what makes this a kingdom decision. If we enter into marriage, it's for the good of the kingdom. If we choose to not enter into marriage, we do so for the good of the kingdom. Paul is clear to note at the end of this that each person is gifted differently. And by this, I tend to mean that Paul thinks that I tend to think that Paul means some have a temperament such that the desire for sexuality is none, or is at least easily manageable without participating in sex. Paul identifies this as a gifting, and that people are different in this, that not everyone is the same. Further, that this isn't just a gifting from some ambiguous source, but it's a gifting that comes from God. It's in the wisdom of God that we have our respective dispositions, and he expects us to use that for his purposes and the kingdom more generally. I know in our weakness, we can curse the ways in which sin has twisted our dispositions. We got these dispositions which are for the purposes of God, and sin twists them. But remember, God has uniquely programmed each of us to fulfill a role distinctly in the kingdom, and the kingdom needs that. And regardless of the state we're in, married or unmarried, we need to seek to live into that. Paul then turns to speak to the widows and the unmarried. It's good for them to remain as he is. This is a really simple instruction. So if you're someone, to talk to you right now, who's not married, perhaps you aren't to the age where it's appropriate to marry. You're still in high school. Perhaps you're at the frustrating tail end of when people usually are getting married and all your friends have gotten married. Perhaps you're coming off a legitimate divorce as described in these texts. Perhaps your spouse died, either young or old. This is the sort of advice that applies to you. It's good to not get married. Just sit with that for a moment, okay? Living your life as a single person is a holy calling. In the eyes of God and in what Paul's writing here, it can be joyful and fulfilling, and knowing Christ to the utmost is fully achievable through this. Often, we chart our lives and set our goals for where we want to be at a certain time. And for many people, it's to get out of high school or college and then get married. As we'll see, that's a holy desire in the next part. Paul does not denigrate marriage in the slightest, but when it comes to God's judgment of you as his child, this isn't a tier system that you're moving up, right? You're moving up, okay, well, now I'm married, now I'm higher on the tier. Certainly not. While there are some moments of illumination and delight that come uniquely in the context of marriage, there are others that come uniquely in the joy and struggle of singleness. There are different insights that come from different stations of life. That's just part of it. It doesn't make anything better or worse. There's unique insights that come from being a mother, an electrician, an accountant, a septic repair person. And the body needs all of them that the body has. The body needs all of these Christ-centered illuminations and understandings about the Word of God and the will of God and the glory of God. They need all of these sorts of things. It's not like people who are single are less mature. My point in pointing out all those vocations is that we don't hold the understanding that a mother gets into the glory of God higher than an electrician, or an accountant or a CEO higher than a septic repair person. They're all just what they are. And it's similarly with being married or being single. It's not like those who are single are less spiritually mature. It is not like you have a cap on you that you cannot hit until you get married. Not true. I've met people who, in their singleness, were the most mature people in the whole church. And I've met married people who were nauseatingly infantile. While church leadership is reserved for those who are married, the church doesn't only need leaders. The church needs people who are single. And we must uphold the sanctity and righteousness of that calling. If the church makes people who have been gifted with singleness feel less than, or that they have no place in the body, shame on us. Shame on us. So if you are single, I want to encourage you that you have immense value in the station that you are in. You have immense value to the kingdom of God. You have so much to offer. You are not second class. You are a full citizen and inheritor of what God has for you in Christ. That said, Paul does want to make sure that he's clear on this, that he has a high view of singlehood because of its functionality that he'll describe, especially later on. I don't want to get too much into that. But he says if an unmarried person doesn't have self-control, they should marry. Later, he will say more explicitly that it's not a sin. Here, it's especially because it's better to marry than to burn, and the italics here mean to burn with passion, or to stay there in sexual desire and lust that's never satisfied. That's not a good place for a person to be. Paul doesn't want us to walk away thinking that he prefers singlehood, and that means everyone needs to neglect the way they're wired. While I would argue that the modern American church has at times overemphasized the need for people to be married, Christianity in the medieval era and all throughout that 1,000 years or so overemphasized singleness and celibacy with the monastic lifestyle, and there was a special emphasis on celibacy as though it was this gift to be desired that was outside of what God's trying to say here and outside of our discussion. But it was lifted up as the most spiritual thing a person could do is be celibate, and that's also wrong. We are not at a contest here. The person who does have the disposition where they're able to not commit sexual immorality and not be married, that's not a person who's better than anyone else either. If people are in a season where they're not wired that way with the self-control to refrain from sexual sin, they should marry, especially if that relationship develops and that desire for sexuality emerges because of that relationship where it's natural to marry that person. Sexuality is an embodied reality, and our bodies are not bad. As Hebrews says, marriage is honorable, and marital relations are pure within that context. It's just as wrong-headed to lift up singleness as it is to lift up marriage as superior. Now, Paul does give advice here. If one is single and can't practice self-control, they should marry. However, there's an issue here, is that takes another person to agree to give their life to you and to live their life with you. If you've got questions on that, we can dive into that in a Q&R. Send it over to us. Drop a comment. If you're watching the video, send us an email in the podcast description. I would love to talk about that more. We just don't have time to do that. Regardless, the point of view here on the purpose of marriage as a Christian is I need to get married to serve in the kingdom. I need to get married with a purpose. I need to get married to glorify Christ. It's not just something I do. If I get married, it needs to fulfill spiritual objectives. It needs to be for a purpose. Not because it's what everybody else is doing, not because there's pressure on me from these people, but it needs to be for the glory of God. So as we close, I want to call out two breakdowns in our culture. I know this will take a little time, but just bear with me here because I think it makes it hard for us to see this. First, it seems that getting married to avoid sexual sin as part of the driver of that is just highly unromantic and kind of self-serving. Secondly, loneliness is so very real that singleness seems like a death sentence at times. Let's say about that. For the first, marriage has become completely about romance. And indeed, that's a beautiful aspect of marriage. Song of Solomon, all wonderful. However, if we just look historically, marriage has been about survival. It's been about mutual sacrifice, the sharing of property, the raising of children, and so forth. The notion of romance being the base default of marriage is a completely modern construct, and I would suggest is actually out of line with the Bible in general as the only thing. Is romance wrong? No, but it's just, there's a lot more to it than that. There's a lot more going on here. Now, as I mentioned back in the history of marriage, there's things that historically are unbiblical. And I'm not advocating we go back to that and say we need arranged marriages. No, I'm not saying that, certainly. But we do need to be corrected that maybe our societal glasses are off and it's wrong. It's about sacrifice. And so anything, if a person enters into that with some level of awareness that it's for the purpose of preventing sexual misconduct, sexual sin, then all the stuff we've said in the last 2 episodes, 1 through 6, applies in that situation as well. Secondly, when it comes to the loneliness factor, we have lost genuine friendship. Our culture has lost that, and genuine, deep love between people, even between men and men or women and women. We're not even talking about men being friends with women and vice versa, and the platonicness of that and the beauty that can be in the right context. There is a lie in our culture that romance, once again, I bring that up, is the highest form of friendship, and that is false. That is false. Once again, the highest and truest form of love is sacrifice. Greater love has no one than this, and that they lay down their lives for their friends. That's true love and friendship. And while in marriage, there's a romantic component that adds a beauty and a spice and a flavor to that that's just incredible and rejoicing to the glory of God, that's not the substance that God is looking for. The substance is in sacrifice and care for other people. While that's something that happens in marriage, the sacrifice that is, it's not relegated there. And so I want to encourage us to pursue real, genuine, self-denying friendship with our fellow Christians, married or unmarried, so that we're not despising the gift that people have been given, married or unmarried, that everyone is in a position to seek the good of the kingdom and not to act out of desperation, because marriage here is not just about what feels good at the time or what I like or what I want to do. It's about seeking the good of the kingdom and the glory of God and not acting out of desperation. Friends, last thing I promise, and we'll get to questions. I've seen too many people act out of desperation in getting married, and that's not good and it's not healthy. It needs to be a kingdom decision with intentionality, entered from a position of strength. If you're single, are you seeking the good of the kingdom? Are you pursuing marriage to grow in holiness and usefulness? Are you staying single to grow in holiness and usefulness? For all of us, are we promoting a church culture where God's view of the goodness of marriage and singleness is equally weighted? Do all members know their value, or have we prioritized single people or married people over the other? What can we do to reinforce genuine biblical giving friendship and love amongst all people? People that we can experience the love of Christ amongst each other and share that with everyone, so that all people can move forward in the kingdom and be blessed by that. Thanks so much for joining us today here at 15 Minutes in a Big Idea. Today's big idea: marriage is a kingdom decision.